Hi, this is our third week, and this is the lecture for week 3, Theories of Ethical Decision Making. I'm doing this because the next several chapters in the Lovin book are talking about these various theories. You're going to be writing about them in those case studies that are assigned for writing. So I wanted to give you an overview and a summary of what these theories are, see if you can kind of put them together in context, and then also have this PowerPoint to refer to if you have questions as you're reading the material in Lovin. It begins with deontology. I'm going to tell you there's three primary different theories that we use in ethical reasoning, a fourth one that has emerged in recent years. But the primary one is called deontology. And I thought since you all are clergy people, you'd like going to the Greek to see how it works. Deon means obligation or duty, and logia or logos, the word or logic. So it's a word or a logic or a reasoning based on duty. That's the main thing to remember about deontology. So that means that there are certain principles and rules which exist that cannot be violated. The ethics of duty, they cannot be violated unless you want to be regarded as absolutely not moral. And it's important to see that right and wrong is not in the action. Right and wrong lies in the motives of the person committing the act, not the act itself. And you'll see how this works when you understand that the deontology does not have regard for the outcome of the action. The primary regard is for the action itself. And so that's why we can say the highest good is good in itself. It's not subject to any qualification. The highest good is to follow the rule and or the principle. Immanuel Kant is the one who wrote about this primarily in the 19th century. And he said, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim become a universal law. That is to say, if it's okay for me to do it, it's okay for anybody else to do it when they're in exactly the same situation. And that's called Kant's categorical imperative. The second way of thinking about it, his second formulation, is that you must always act to treat every person as an end and never as a means only. He does leave some room there to say that sometimes we do need other people to help us get things done. But the primary objective is that every person is the end. They are the most important thing. More about deontology. The focus is on the act, as I said. It's not on the outcome. Sometimes you will get an outcome that you don't want when you follow the rules, but you should be content morally in knowing that you followed the rule. Kant would argue that over the long haul, if we always follow the rules and obey and conform to the principles, everybody's going to be better off in the long run. So decisions are based on these absolute commands of universal application that he calls the categorical imperatives. And we could go through and identify categorical imperatives that occur in our world, uh, in our own lives, but they're ones that generally would exist anywhere, not just in one culture or community. This assumption probably is bothersome when he says there are certain perfect duties, and those perfect duties must be performed. So all of it's based on the respect for persons. It's about treating people well, about treating people the same. And so the procedure is really simple. If you have a problem come up, an issue, you find the rule, you identify the rule, point at the rule, and follow the rule. It's that simple. Now, an easier way to understand it, I think, is through the moral rules theory of Bernard Goethe. Goethe's a 20th century and early 21st century philosopher who died just a few years ago. And his theory was not widely adopted until more recently. The folks who wrote the predominant textbook in bioethics, Beecham and Childress, began to take note of Goethe's theory and to give it recognition. And that brought it into a much better acceptance among people who talked ethics. But Goethe says morality requires us to follow the moral rules. Now that's Kantian in its base, but he has a little more nuance to it. He says anytime we violate a moral rule, we need an excuse or a justification, or else we are acting immorally. So you see, Goethe takes the categorical imperative, but allows that there could always be circumstances in which we want to set the rule aside. And we'll talk about how he thinks you can do that and do so morally. So here's the premise. If a moral rule is being violated, then there is an ethical issue to be addressed. If no moral rule is being violated, then there's no ethical issue. And Kant makes it, not Kant, but Gert makes it even simpler. He says there are 10 moral rules, only 10. He says you can go anywhere in the world, any culture, any economy, any educational system, doesn't matter where, go anywhere in the world, the smallest culture or the largest one, and the moral rules are pretty much the same, because these are the rules that we choose to follow so that we can live safely and productively with others. Now, before we look at the rules, Gert reminds us to distinguish between moral rules and moral ideals. We have a lot of moral ideals. Wouldn't it be nice if everybody did such and such? And sometimes we tend to treat those like rules and get angry with people who don't conform to the ideal. But Gert would remind us that moral rules, the ones that address prohibitions, like thou shalt not do one thing or another, those are rules. But moral ideals are designed to encourage positive action. And it's not expected that anyone would achieve the moral ideals. They're aspirational. They're things toward which we strive in life. Not a rule, but something that would make us a better person if we follow it. And this would take us back to Aristotle's concept of flourishing, that it's aspirational. If we all conform to these ideals, of course, everyone would flourish, society would flourish, and happiness would be the predominant feature. Here's the simple basis. One can be punished for violating a moral rule, but not for failing a moral ideal, because moral ideals are not expected regularly to be met. It's the ones we say, as I said, wouldn't it be nice if everybody here could do such and such? But nobody's going to be sent away or punished because they didn't meet it. We're just saying it would be nice. That's an ideal. Gert's 10 moral rules, as I said, he thinks they would apply anywhere in the world, and he came upon them inductively, saying there's certain kinds of actions that everyone counts as moral. Now, when I say that he comes upon them inductively, induction means you see the same thing happening over and over and over the same way, and eventually you can make a rule out of it. You believe this is the way it always should be or always the way it will be. And then you can use that rule deductively to apply to any situation that arises. So there are certain kinds of actions that everyone regards as moral. And here are his 10 moral rules. Don't kill, don't cause pain, don't disable, don't deprive of freedom, don't deprive of pleasure, don't deceive, keep your promise, don't cheat, obey the law, and lastly, do your duty. Now, Gert says it's people say that it's convenient that he had only 10, and he says although he's a Jew and very fond of the 10 Commandments, he doesn't see these as being the same as the 10 Commandments, because the 10 Commandments are not as globally inclusive as he believes these rules are. Some people who say my only code is the 10 Commandments, they're going to have difficulty fitting everything that comes up in life into those commandments. Gert thinks we can much better use his rules to help interpret all of our moral codes into one simple set of 10 rules. Here's the condition. If there's a rule like don't kill, like don't cause pain, the norm is that we don't violate the rule. That's what makes it deontological. We follow norms of behavior. But if we decide to violate the rule in a particular case, it must be justified through a predetermined process, or it's a broken rule and it must be punished. Now, what do we mean by a predetermined process? It means that everybody agrees that we can make the decision the same way. Everyone is always to obey the rule, except when an impartial, rational person, we don't know that there really is such a thing, but that's kind of the ideal. An impartial, rational person can advocate that violating it be publicly allowed. Now look at those underlined parts. First, it's an impartial person, a rational person. And then the behavior, the action, must be publicly allowed. We're not talking about breaking moral rules in secret, in the dark. It always makes me curious why executions in states that still have execution allow them to be done in the dark. They're done in the dark. They don't want people to see it happening. So then Gertz says anyone who violates the rules when an impartial, rational person could not advocate that such a violation be publicly allowed, well, that person may be punished. So what do you think? Do we violate any of Gert's moral rules? Look again. Don't kill. Do we ever kill? What about causing pain? Those of us who are in healthcare know that certainly we do cause pain. Sometimes we disable through amputations. We deprive of freedom when we decide people need to be put in jail. And sometimes we deceive and we think we're doing the right thing, but you'd have to have a justification that says your impartial, rational person would always say that the deceive in that case is all right. So this takes us back to the understanding that if a rule is not being violated, there is no ethical issue. Now, I think I talked to you about Gert's rules in another presentation earlier, but I keep coming back to them because I think they so simply help us understand how deontology works, how it is to have a set of values, principles, and rules, and why they are important, and yet how we can make exception to them. So in one respect, I apologize for the redundancy, but in another, I wanted you to hear it in the context of all of these ethical theories as well. Well, we go on to the principles approach. Tom Beecham and James Childress wrote the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, and it's been around for a long time. It's in its 7th edition now. It's kind of the Bible of biomedical ethics. And they identify the principles approach, which is their main theory. It begins with that Kantian claim that I have a duty to behave in a certain way because it is how a reasonable person would act. It's a very deontological statement. And we have a duty, for example, to be loyal or honest or caring or other qualities that you might identify. These are part of our duty. When Kant was talking about there are certain perfect duties that we must always conform to. Well, they say in healthcare ethics, if you'll let me talk healthcare for just a moment, that there are 4 principles. And these 4 principles really can apply in most situations in life, but when we're working in healthcare ethics, we always refer to these 4. The first is autonomy, then beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. I wanted to go ahead and put this here. We're going to be doing healthcare ethics probably in week 8, but I wanted to go ahead and include this in this presentation so you'd see it in the context of the other theories we're looking at. Well, by autonomy, we mean the individual's right to choose one's own outcome. So we can ask the questions, does my action impinge on somebody's personal autonomy? Am I denying them the right to determine their own course of action and their own destiny? And do everybody who's affected, not just the person toward whom my action may be directed, but everyone who's affected, consent to my action? And do I acknowledge, and this is important, do I acknowledge and do I respect that others may choose differently than I would choose, and it is their right to do so? We so often hear this going on in the waiting rooms and intensive care when family members will get contrary with one another over what should be the next care decision regarding a patient who's declining pretty quickly in the intensive care unit. And is it okay sometimes for us to make a decision that not everybody would agree with? As long as we feel like that it stands up to moral rigor, then that's how we do things. That is respecting everyone's autonomy. Of course, there are limits to that autonomy as well, so long as we don't injure someone else in exercising our own autonomy, then we are morally justified. Beneficence is about doing good, and we want to identify who benefits from my action and how. It's for the patient in healthcare, first of all, not anybody else, not the family, nobody. It's for the patient. We always ask in healthcare, and I think it's true in many aspects of life, do we look at the burdens and the benefits of the decision I'm about to make and ask which is greater, the burdens or the benefits? If the burdens are greater, then we have to really struggle to figure out if the benefit gain justifies the load of burden that we're asking the individual to bear. And I like this phrase well, sometimes paternalism can trump autonomy. Paternalism is in healthcare, it's when the doctor knows best. In families, it's when dad knows best or mom knows best and trumps everybody else's autonomy. And you know how that goes right on through adulthood. It doesn't stop when you turn 18 and move away from home. There still is that effort of paternalism trying to trump others' decisions within a culture or organization where people live together. Non-maleficence is kind of the other end of the spectrum of beneficence, but it has a little bit of difference. It's about not doing evil. And if we go back to the Hippocratic Oath that was written in the 3rd century BC, the main emphasis of that was don't do things that are evil. Always do good for your patients. And so we ask, in whatever kind of decision we're making, think of it in a church setting as well. Which parties may be harmed by my decision and by my action? And in healthcare, I would say is the patient or the family, the community, the healthcare system. But take that down into the church. What groups are being harmed? What individuals are being harmed? Or at the very least, how are they being neglected or not included? And so if we can acknowledge where this harm may be happening, we need to pause to take time to see what steps can I take to minimize this harm, to make sure that no one is disadvantaged by the decision and by the action that is coming. Have I communicated risks of treatment, we'd say in healthcare, in an open and truthful manner, because we want families and patients to be able to make good decisions in healthcare. And when we're in medical research, we always ask, have the subjects been fully informed prior to consent? There are many case examples where research was done and subjects in research were not fully informed and they were surprised how things turned out. You could well know people, have church members who think it's a good idea to go sign up and participate in a study of some new drug that might address an illness that they have. You need to help them understand that they still have all the control about participating in those studies. The fourth one is justice. And if we're talking healthcare, we're talking about having finite healthcare resources. But we can even look at it a bigger picture in society. There's only so many dollars. There's only so many things that we can do for one another. How do we choose who gets what? How do we choose? The issue is called distributive justice. How do we make decisions about who gets something? Because there's never enough to go around. If we were in a pandemic, with an influenza pandemic, which attacks the respiratory system, you'd have people lining up at hospitals who needed ventilator support. And we already know through advanced planning that in our cities, we don't have enough ventilators if everybody needed one. And so decisions would be made who gets one and who does not. That can be true in any venue that we live in or are functioning in. We never have enough for everybody to get everything. So how do we make those decisions in a way to ensure justice? You remember this week I asked you to tell me the difference between justice and fairness, so I won't go there. I'll wait until I can read your discussion this week, and then we'll talk about it some more. Finally, we ask, is my proposed action equitable? Can I make it more equitable? So if you're in a leadership position in your church, for example, and you have the authority to make a decision about how the church is going to do something, these last two questions are ones that you really want to ask to make sure that you are being just. Distributive justice has several material principles, and I think it's interesting to look at these as our country continues to be in a conversation, a debate, an argument, wherever you stand on it, about health care and how much health care the government should provide and who should have health care. Now, if you understand first that health care is finite, it's like putting marbles in a jar. There's only so many, and when there are no more marbles, nobody else can get anything. So understanding that, how shall we divide those marbles up? Is it just a basic principle that we give everyone an equal share? Or do we get more sophisticated and say, no, we give them these marbles according to their need. We give them their health care according to need. We give them food assistance according to need. We give them housing support according to need. Or do we say, no, need is not enough? We need to consider what kind of effort they have made to make out for themselves. how hard have they been working to make do before they ask for assistance? So according to effort, do we divide things up according to the effort people have demonstrated? Some people greater effort than others, so they get more assistance than the others. Or according to contribution, this means not the effort is about what I do to help make myself better. But maybe we should divide these finite resources up according to the contribution an individual makes to society, to the greater whole, if you're trying to do it in a church, what contribution does this person make to the church? If somebody says, I need some financial assistance, do we say, well, wait a minute now, how much have you done for this congregation? We don't have enough money for everybody, so those who have worked the hardest for the church are the ones who are going to get it. I think there are some parables that address this issue. Or could we say according to merit? Those who have been the best, done the best in everything, they've got the ribbons and the merit badges on their shirt. And finally, when we're talking about health care, we say, are we going to do it by free market exchange? In other words, the ones who have the means are the ones who get the health care. Those who have money get what they need. And that's free market exchange. So the question always, in whatever setting we're in, is how do we decide who gets what? And these are the 6 prominent principles that inform those decisions. I think most of the time we work in that last one, free market exchange, although we like to think that we address it according to need. But we can tell by our conversations around healthcare the last 10 or 15 years that we still aren't convinced that we need to divide it up that way. A lot of us who have great health insurance, for example, don't want to give away some of our health insurance so that somebody else may have more because we've worked hard to get it. We've contributed to our society. We've made the effort, and we've done a good job, and we deserve to have our blue ribbon health insurance while there are others who have none. So those are the kinds of issues that we have, and this helps us understand that everybody thinks they're right because they come from a different principle of how things should be distributed when we don't have enough for everybody. Well, that was deontology, the long version. Next is teleology, also considered as consequentialism. And I use the Greek here again. Telos means the end, the purpose, or the goal of something. So we choose our actions based on the outcome that we're seeking. And we justify our behavior by the outcome, not by following a rule or a principle, but by saying, yes, that is the goal, that is the outcome that I want. See if you can understand this illustration here. Say, if life were one big dartboard with happiness the bullseye, then morality would be the feathers on the dart that we shoot. Now you understand that feathers on a dart help guide the dart. They help keep it going straight and where you want it to go, toward the bullseye. And this would be very much in conformance with Aristotle, who says if you want to flourish, if you want to be happy, then you want to live a virtuous life. So we could say that the feathers are what define the virtue in our lives that help us achieve the happiness in life. Consequentialism is the other word people use for teleology. Basically, it just means the rightness of an act is determined by its end. I'm a little cynical here. I shouldn't say it this way. What shall we do? Well, it depends. That's kind of the way people kind of, say there's no need to argue about it, to even worry about it. But this is what we always say, really, when we're making a decision. You can be in a group of people anywhere discussing a course of action we should take, and always we're going to say, well, it depends. It depends on what resources we have. It depends on what outcome we want. It depends on how it's going to affect other people that aren't directly involved. It depends. We're all concerned about what our action is going to do, what it's going to cause for people after we perform the action. Whereas in strict deontology, we'd say if we know the action is right because it is a perfect duty, then the fact that some people receive negative benefit from it is not relevant. Overall, it's the best thing to do. Consequentialism says, no, that's not true. We need to be looking at the outcome for everyone. Utilitarianism is kind of the classic form of consequentialism, which means the greatest balance of good over evil for the most people. This is a hard one, of course, to achieve, And it's an ideal that we don't. I go back again to the healthcare debates in the United States. If we were utilitarian, then we would readily be saying we want to find the greatest balance of good over evil for the greatest number of persons. In other words, we're going to create a level playing field on this healthcare so everybody can get pretty much the same thing, even though nobody gets everything they may need. We've made a balance of good over evil for the greatest number of persons possible. And that has not been very appealing in our culture. You can think about why that is not appealing in our particular culture. I can't just say it's an issue of capitalism, because it's not. There are a lot of sociological factors that give us the propensity to resist a utilitarian approach to distributing goods for persons. Another version, this ethical egoism, gets pretty self-centered. It says moral agents should act in their own self-interest. That is ethical egoism, that I don't have to have regard for how my actions affect everybody else. I should have regard that they don't hurt somebody else. But if the actions are in my own self-interest, then that is my morality. So that's a very relativistic type of ethics that people practice in that regard. It sounds kind of silly, but you start listening to folks, and sometimes, especially your children, other adults too, and you will hear people making decisions on this basis. It's kind of, I want to do this because I want the outcome. I can't go through this without mentioning Joseph Fletcher. It's a long time ago that Joseph Fletcher wrote his book Situation Ethics and kind of riled up things. And without going into detail, I can recommend you read it. It's an older book, and the language is kind of stiff. But his principle is, he is an Episcopal priest, and his principle was that we should always do the most loving thing. If we're looking at a dilemma of two choices to take, and it seems like they both have negative and positive, we try to figure out which would be the most loving thing to do. No other rules, no other guidelines, just in this case, what is most loving. And then we ask, of course, just loving toward the direct recipient of our action, or loving to everybody else in the world in a utilitarian way. You'll have to read Fletcher if you want to get into more detail. But he thought this was the summary of the New Testament ethic that Jesus was teaching, especially through Matthew and Luke. Always do the most loving thing. Third is virtue ethics. I believe Lovin calls it aretiology. I had not used that word before reading Lovin, but it's the word that is appropriate for it. And virtue ethics is essentially what Aristotle and his peers were teaching. Virtue is about the well-lived life, and it's how we flourish in life, how we achieve happiness. Virtue is excellence in fulfilling a particular function. You can think of different words that represent virtues that you see in other people, and you'll say that virtue exists in that person. He is honest, or he has integrity, or he's always fair. We see those as virtues that they have excellence in fulfilling. And the ethic guides them in that. It emphasizes the character of the moral agent more than rules or consequences. The idea is that if we are always following virtue and continuing to develop as virtuous persons, our actions towards others will always be virtuous as well. So it's about our character. That character then informs everything. It makes me think back. I like to tell this. I remember, especially after my dad died and people were gathering for a funeral and so on, but in years prior to that too, as he was sick, so many of his peers and people from the church, as well as his business world, would just say the one thing they thought he illustrated to people more than anything else was integrity. Now, the real meaning of integrity is, I am who I say I am. I do what I say I will do. And he had a reputation for really strongly representing that virtue among the people that he worked and lived. So that's what virtues are like. They identify who we are. They identify how people understand us to be. And sometimes we have ministers who are not virtuous people, you know. They say the right words, but the virtue does not come through. There's another book that I'm going to spend some time talking about later during our course, written by a UCC minister, where she really talks about some of the ways that ministers just deceive their parishioners. There's not a bit of virtue among them because everything they do as preachers and ministers is for their own gain and not to care for their congregation. Well, then next, the normative ethical philosophies that emphasize being rather than doing. That's virtue. Being rather than doing. Who we are then will inform every action we take, everything we choose to do. Here are some virtues that Beecham and Childress list in their book, and I can't argue with these. These are very important ones. These are questions we ask about the people that we do business with, the people we choose as friends, the people that we experience when we're selecting a church, when we're trying to select a minister to lead our church. It's certainly what we ask when we're selecting a physician or a healthcare organization. These are all important virtues, and I know you could continue to add to that list. I threw this up here in case we have any Boy Scouts around. The Boy Scouts is basically a virtue training organization. We are trying to lead young boys into embracing these virtues and making them a way of life. Remember, the principle is who we are always informs what we do. And so the emphasis here on the Scout Law is on who we are becoming. We are becoming trustworthy and loyal and helpful. That's virtue ethics. Finally, a brief word about the ethic of care. Now, this is one that emerged in healthcare. Actually, it started with Kohlberg, who I talked to you about with regard to moral development theory. And then it was taken further from there by Carol Gilligan, a psychologist from Harvard, and then developed more as a practice among nurses and social workers and others who provide care in the healthcare milieu. I think, though, it's very appropriate for ministers to be aware of this ethic of care. And we can spend some more time on it later if you'd like to. One article that I've listed here, Rita Manning, that's available on a reader. It's not, you couldn't find it online, it's in a book, but if you have a strong library nearby, you would probably find this collection of readings. Well, ethic of care is a way of understanding our own moral role, of how we look at moral issues and how we come to an accommodation in moral situations. I remember reading an article in Interpretation Journal back when I was in seminary a lifetime ago, and I was asked to do a presentation to our journal club on an article about Christ accommodating himself to humankind, and came to really understand what that accommodation means. It means I will make changes in how I present myself to you, how I choose to help you, how I choose to be with you, out of an awareness of who you are and what your needs are. By the way, when she talks about a moral role here, she means a moral situation. There's the word right there, this below. A moral situation is one in which you are seeking a determination of right and wrong action. That's always our ethical situation, always trying to figure out the right thing to do. This is just a much nicer way to say it. The ethic of care has 5 central issues. And imagine yourself as a counseling pastor. Imagine yourself as just a family member or a friend. In any kind of role, these would be appropriate principles for providing an ethic of care, to the people that you are caring for. First is moral attention. You try to be aware of what the right thing to do is, always trying to discern the right thing to do, because there are always choices in how you respond to a person. Always being aware of if that other person, the one who's receiving your care, is inviting you to do some things that you don't think are fully moral. It's just a matter of being alert and always being willing to ask the question, is this the right thing to do? I think if we had that going on in our lives at all times, we would get along better, but it's too easy to forget to ask that question all the time. Manning lists sympathetic understanding. Now, sympathy means coming alongside of someone, not stepping in their shoes as we do when we empathize, but coming alongside of them in their suffering and trying to understand what they are experiencing. And because so often our tendency is to tell them what they ought to feel, how they ought to feel it. Oh, no, you don't mean that, or you don't feel that way. What we want to do is try to draw along beside them. If it's somebody we're counseling, just being a friend to, somebody who stops you in a hallway someplace and shares a problem with you, are we trying to understand how they are being fully affected by that event in their lives? Relationship awareness means trying to be aware of everyone in that person's life. Accommodation, as I said, trying to make my actions work for the person that I'm trying to help. And then finally, response. How do I choose to respond and to take action on behalf and in help of that person that I'm talking to? Here's a chart that I like that a friend of mine who drew, Terry Roselle. He says, here's how we respond to an ethical dilemma. We begin by discerning, trying to figure out what the right thing to do might be. And then we deliberate. We talk about it, we think about it, we read about it, we get other people to join us in talking about it. Finally, we make a decision, and then we act. We do something. And as soon as we act and have an awareness of what we're doing, with that moral awareness that care ethics says we should follow, we are right back to discerning once again, always evaluating how we're making choices and what choices we're making. I've mentioned to you before H. Richard Niebuhr, I believe, who wrote The Responsible Self back in 1962. But buried in that book somewhere in the middle are two questions he asked whenever we are trying to make an ethical response to something, trying to make an ethical decision of what we should do next. He says two questions. One, ask what's going on. Look at everything. Get the full view of what's going on in this situation. That's what discernment is. Trying to figure out what really is happening here, not just what appears on the surface or what somebody else has told you, but try to really get a big view of what's happening before you try to make your choice. And then the next question is, it's a better question than just what shall I do next. Niebuhr says, what is the fitting moral response or the appropriate moral response? There may be a number potential ones, but which seems to be the most fitting? That's the result of our deliberation. And of course, in doing so, we answer that question 2.5. Why is that true?